Welcome to this online study of an introduction to the prophets. For those of you who may not know me, my name is Charlie Walden. We had originally planned this study as an in-person study, but then there is this coronavirus pandemic, so we're doing something different than we normally would do. We did a 16-week study on the book of Genesis this past summer, used the same basic format, so it seemed to work okay. It's not ideal, but this is 2020 after all. This study is 4 weeks long. The first discussion session will be Sunday, November 1st at 5 p.m. I want to talk for a moment about the mechanics of the class, how it is supposed to work. Once a week, early in the week, we will post a new pre-recorded session of the study on Northgate's website. Each session will be about 30 to 45 minutes in length. Generally, it should be available by Monday morning. You can watch it anytime that is convenient for you. On Sunday evenings at 5 p.m., there will be a follow-up Zoom session to discuss the current week's study session. If you have signed up for the follow-up Zoom session, we will send you instructions on how to connect to the session. If you haven't used Zoom before, it's not too difficult. You just need a computer or a tablet or iPad or phone with a camera in it and internet access. If you're watching this, you can probably do Zoom. Or you can call into the phone number provided and just talk and listen. The discussion session is for anyone who has some ideas that they want to talk about, or who has questions about some of the material covered in this week's lesson, or just wants to listen to the discussion. I have a couple of discussion questions to get us started. I expect Sunday evening session should be about 30 minutes to an hour in length. You do need to sign up in advance to participate in the follow-up Zoom session. You cannot connect to the Zoom session until we send you the link and passcode. If you haven't yet signed up, you may send an email to online.classes@northgateumc.org and say you want to participate in the Sunday discussion session of the Introduction to the Prophets. Again, that address is online.classes@northgateumc.org. The only textbook for this study is the Bible, but we're not going to read every word of the books we will talk about. In fact, we're only going to read a little bit from the Bible, a few verses here and a few there. This is an overview study. But let's begin with a word of prayer. Oh God, our Father, open our eyes and enlighten our minds as we study your word. So grant that our minds may know your truth, and our hearts may feel your love, and then confirm and strengthen our wills that we may go out to live what we have learned. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. I want to talk for a minute about the format of the discussion on Sunday evenings. The primary rules for the discussion are respect other people on the call. If you're new to Zoom, learn where the mute button is. When you're not talking, leave the mute button on. When you want to talk, take your computer off mute. If there are only a handful of people on the call, you won't need to do that. But if there are 10 or 12 people on the call, you will definitely need to have your mute button on unless you're talking. Turn off your television, or at least turn off the volume. If you can hear it, everybody else can hear it too. A quick disclaimer here, a lot of Bible studies are led by pastors who have been to seminary or have experience teaching on a particular topic. I am not a pastor, I've never been to seminary, I have no formal training in biblical study or teaching the Bible. I'm a layperson. I buy a book about a topic or the Bible, and I present the ideas in that book or commentary to the best of my ability. I have led this particular study 3 times previously, but that does not make me an expert. As I've said before, this class is introductory in nature. We are not going to read a verse and then spend an hour discussing it. We are going to focus on stories, mostly in chronological order. And we are going to look at major themes, and we are going to look at the worldview and how it seems to change over time. Mostly in this study, we're going to tell the stories of the period of Israel's history between the end of Exodus, the death of Moses, and the return from exile in Babylon. If I leave something out that you want to talk about, we can talk about it in the discussion session on Sunday evening. In this study, we're going to talk about two major biblical groupings, the former prophets and the latter prophets. There are 6 books in the traditional Hebrew Bible called the former prophets. There are 15 books in the Bible called the latter prophets. And we're going to discuss them all in 4 weeks. So understand this is an overview. We're not going to get into all the nitty-gritty details. I also want to make clear that the categorizations we're talking about here is from the Hebrew Bible. In most Christian Bibles, the first 6 books we're going to discuss are part of the books normally categorized as historical books. And the other 15 are considered part of the prophetic books. The books are the same in both the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament. They're just categorized differently. So I'd like to start with a definition. What is a prophet? A commonly used Christian definition might be something like, a prophet is someone who receives messages from God, mainly concerning events that will take place in the future, and conveys them to a certain group of people or singular person whom God intends to hear the delivered message. A lot of times we get hung up on the part on conveying messages about the future, as in a prophet is someone who forecasts the coming of Christ sometime in the future. So Christians often tend to think of a prophet as someone who foretold the coming of Christ. The term prophet we use here is somewhat broader than that. A prophet is not someone who can predict the future. That's a fortune teller, an oracle, or a seer. A prophet is a human being who is an intermediary who transmits a divine message of God to a third party. It is just a message. It doesn't have to be about the future. So when we start talking about prophets, hold this idea in your mind. A prophet is a human being who is an intermediary who transmits a divine message of God to a third party. Now we're going to talk for a little bit about the books of the Old Testament. The first 5 books of the Old Testament are called the Torah, or sometimes the Pentateuch, or the Law, or the 5 books of Moses. Here, we're going to call them the Torah. These books begin with Genesis, which tells the story of creation, how God created the heavens and the earth, the story of Adam, the first man, Eve, the first woman, and how God expelled them from the Garden of Eden for disobeying him. We hear the story of Cain, who killed his brother Abel. After 10 generations of people, God was so disgusted that he caused a great flood on the earth, and only Noah and his family survived on an ark. These stories, whether historical, factual, or metaphorical, certainly often sound much like fairy tales, like Once Upon a Time stories. For example, the story of the Tower of Babel from Genesis 11. I'm going to read this from the New Revised Standard Version. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar, and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, otherwise we shall be scattered abroad upon the face of the earth." The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which mortals had built. And the Lord said, "Look, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language there, so that they will not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over all the face of the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. So the worldview at this point was something called static. It's, I am going to do what my father did. My sons will do what I have done. My daughters will do what their mothers have done. Nothing really ever changes over time, unless, of course, God causes those changes. Then in chapter 12, still in Genesis, we introduce Abraham. At this point, he's called Abram. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went as the Lord had told him. So the worldview now included a future that was different from the past. God had told Abraham about this future that was going to be different. So when Abraham was led by God to Canaan, the land that God had promised him, and Abraham had two sons, Ishmael, who became the father of the Ishmaelites, and Isaac, who is to carry out the promises that God had made to Abraham. Isaac had two sons, Esau and Jacob. God changed Jacob's name to Israel. Israel had 12 sons who ultimately became the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. But in the meantime, there was a famine in the land of Canaan, and the children of Israel went to Egypt, where after many years they became slaves of the Egyptian Pharaoh. The book of Exodus tells the story of Moses, who with God's help broke the bonds of slavery and led the children of Israel out of Egypt and back to the promised land. But their journey back took 40 years. And in these 40 years they spent wandering in the wilderness. God gave Moses the law. First, God chiseled the 10 Commandments onto stone tablets. But then there were enough other laws to fill much of the books of Leviticus and Numbers, 2 other books of the Torah. And most of the book of Deuteronomy, the 5th book of the Torah, is made up of what is known as the Deuteronomic law. And God did other things during the 40 years in the desert. Among those things God did was to make Aaron, the brother of Moses, his priest. Finally, Moses and the children of Israel came to the Jordan River and were ready to cross back into Canaan, the promised land. But because the people had not always done as God had told them, God would not allow Moses to cross back into Canaan. And Moses died. So this is where we begin the 6 books of the former prophets: Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. If you know much about these books, you can see why in most Christian Bibles these books are considered to be historical in nature, because they tell the story of Israel from the death of Moses through the time of the Judges, and then David and the great kings of Israel to the destruction of Jerusalem, the exile of the people of Israel in Babylon, the end of the monarchy. The other historical books in the Christian Bible include the 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which are largely duplicates of other earlier writings, Ezra and Nehemiah, written during the Second Temple period, 150 years after exile, and the biographies of Ruth and Esther, which are generally considered historical novels. The other books in the Old Testament include the wisdom books like Job and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, and the poetic books, Psalms, the Song of Solomon, and Lamentations, which is a poem attributed to Jeremiah. Finally, there is Daniel, which is an apocalypse. That rounds out the books of the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible. In all, there are 39 books in the Old Testament, and we're going to talk about over half of them, 21 books, in this 4-week class. We're going to start with the book of Joshua, which takes up its story after the end of Deuteronomy and the death of Moses. There's no scholarly consensus on exactly when the exodus from Egypt would have taken place, but it's generally placed between 1450 and 1250 BCE. So the crossing of the Jordan by Joshua would have been between about 1400 and 1200 BCE. The last of the minor prophets was probably written around 450 to 400 BCE. So the period we'll be talking about in this study is somewhere between 750 and 1,000 years. From the time Joshua crossed the Jordan River until the book of Jonah was written. Could have been as much as 1,000 years. But we're going to pause for a moment and talk about the worldview at the beginning of Joshua. Abraham had been promised a great nation by God, something to happen in the future. One of the things that has happened is the coming of the law. The Hebrew people now have what is now known as the law of Moses. The Hebrew people, the children of Israel, seem to believe in henotheism, one God per nation. If you remember, the Ten Commandments tell us that you shall have no other gods before me. Nothing about there being no other God, just no other gods before me. There are three major stories in the Hebrew Bible. The first is the Exodus, which includes the story of the Passover, the story that we just talked about. It's the story that takes the Hebrew people from bondage to liberation. The second is the story of the exile in Babylon. This is a story of grief and longing when the temple was destroyed and the Hebrew people are taken away from their homes to exile in Babylon. Finally, there is the priestly story. This is the story of sin, guilt, sacrifice, forgiveness. It is a story repeated over and over and over in the Bible. There's a fourth, not quite so major story, the story of David the king, the pinnacle of Jewish history. In this study, we have already finished talking about the Exodus, but we will talk quite a bit about the other three, the exile, the priestly story, and the David story. So hold on to these three concepts, the exile, the priestly story, and the David story, and we will get back to them. For now, let's go to Joshua. God said to Joshua, Moses is dead. Now proceed to cross the Jordan. That's how it starts. Your leader is dead. Your leader who brought you out of slavery in Egypt, gave you the law from God, the one who has led you through the wilderness for 40 years is dead. He's dead. He's gone. He's not coming back. Now get your butt across the river. I'm going to read Joshua 1 through 17. This, again, is from the New Revised Standard Version. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord spoke to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' assistant, saying, My servant Moses is dead. Now proceed to cross the Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I am giving to them, to the Israelites. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you, as I promised to Moses. From the wilderness and the Lebanon as far as the great river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites, the great sea in the west shall be your territory. No one shall be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not fail you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall put this people in possession of the land that I swore to their ancestors to give them. Only be strong and very courageous, being careful to act in accordance with all the law that my servant Moses commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, so that you may be successful wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart out of your mouth. You shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to act in accordance with all that is written in it. For then you shall make your way prosperous, and then you shall be successful. I hereby command you, be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened or dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Then Joshua commanded the officers of the people, Pass through the camp and command to the people, Prepare your provisions, for in 3 days you are to cross over the Jordan, to go to take possession of the land that the Lord your God gives you to possess. To the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, Joshua said, Remember the word that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, saying, The Lord your God is providing you a place of rest, and will give you this land. Your wives, your little ones, and your livestock shall remain in the land that Moses gave you beyond the Jordan. But all the warriors among you shall cross over, armed before your kindred, and shall help them, until the Lord gives rest to your kindred as well as to you. And they too shall take possession of the land that the Lord God is giving them.
Then you shall return to your own land and take possession of it, the land that Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you beyond the Jordan to the east." They answered Joshua, "All that you have commanded us we will do, and wherever you send us we will go. Just as we obeyed Moses in all things, so we will obey you. Only may the Lord your God be with you, as he was with Moses."
So this is the story of the start of the story of Joshua as a new leader. He's the new leader of the children of Israel, and he's prepared to cross the river and take possession of the land. But God has reminded him of the importance of the law that he had given to Moses. Before they cross over, Joshua sends in spies to get the lay of the land. Then the whole nation crosses over the Jordan with the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant, which contains the 10 Commandments. Now we're going to go on and read from chapter 4, verse 1 through 9. When the entire nation had finished crossing over the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, "Select 12 men from the people, one from each tribe, and command them, take 12 stones from here, out of the middle of the Jordan, and place from the place where the priest's feet stood. Carry them over with you, and lay them down in the place where you're camped tonight." Then Joshua summoned the 12 men from the Israelites whom he had appointed, one from each tribe. Joshua said to them, "Pass on before the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan, and each of you take up a stone on his shoulder, one for each of the tribes of Israelites, so that this may be a sign among you. When your children ask in time to come, 'What do these stones mean to you?' then you shall tell them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off in front of the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed over the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones shall be to the Israelites a memorial forever." The Israelites did as Joshua had commanded. They took up 12 stones out of the middle of the Jordan according to the number of the tribes of the Israelites, as the Lord told Joshua, carried them over with them to the place where they camped, and laid them down there. Joshua set up 12 stones in the middle of the Jordan, in the place where the feet of the priests bearing the ark of the covenant had stood, and they are there to this day. So they've crossed the river at Gilgal, and they're in Canaan. But amazingly enough, there are already people there, the Canaanites who think they own the land. Joshua needs a plan for actually conquering the inhabitants of the land. His first target is the walled city of Jericho. They begin by surrounding the city and placing the city under siege. So we go to Joshua 6, verse 1 through 10. Now Jericho was shut up inside and out because of the Israelites. No one came out and no one went in. The Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have handed Jericho over to you, along with its king and soldiers. You shall march around the city, all the warriors circling the city once. Thus you shall do for 6 days, with 7 priests bearing 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. On the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, the priests blowing the trumpets. When they make a long blast with the ram's horn, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat. And all the people shall charge straight ahead." So Joshua son of Nun summoned the priests and said to them, "Take up the Ark of the Covenant, and have 7 priests carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns in front of the Ark of the Lord." To the people he said, "Go forward and march around the city. Have the armed men pass on before the Ark of the Lord." As Joshua had commanded, the people of the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the Lord went forward, blowing the trumpets, with the Ark of the Covenant and the Lord following them. And the armed men went before the priests who blew the trumpets. The rear guard came after the ark, while the trumpets blew continually. To the people Joshua gave this command: "You shall not shout, or let your voice be heard, nor shall you utter a word until the day I tell you to shout. Then you shall shout." So that's what they do. They parade around the outside walls, they blow the trumpets, and the walls come tumbling down. Then they went inside the city and killed every man, woman, and child, as well as the oxen, the sheep, and the donkeys. Only Rahab, a Canaanite prostitute who had sheltered Joshua's spies and her family were spared. And so it went. Joshua fought battles all over Canaan. Occasionally, when the people of Israel didn't follow God's word, they were defeated. But usually they won. And where they won, they divided up the land among the 12 tribes. So I'm going to read now from chapter 13, verse 1 through 7. It's a little bit farther down the road, but still part of the same story here. Now Joshua was old and advanced in years, and the Lord said to him, "You are old and advanced in years, and very much of the land still remains to be possessed. This is the land that still remains, all the regions of the Philistines and all those of the Geshurites, from Shanhor, which is east of Egypt, northward to the boundary of Ekron. It is reckoned as Canaanite. There are 5 rulers of the Philistines, those of Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gath, and Ekron, and those of the Evium in the south, all the land of the Canaanites, and the Merah that belongs to the Sidonians, to Apek, to the boundary of the Amorites, and the land of the Gebites, and all of Lebanon toward the east, from Baal-gad below Mount Hermon to Lebo-hamath, all the inhabitants of the hill country, from Lebanon to Mizrath-maim, even all the Sidonians. I will myself drive them out before the Israelites. Only allot the land to Israel for an inheritance, as I have commanded you. Now therefore divide this land for an inheritance to the 9 tribes and the half-tribe of Manasseh." So for the next 11 chapters of Joshua, we read about conquering different peoples over Canaan and dividing up the land so that each of the 12 tribes has its own territory. When the children of Israel were committed and followed God's instructions, they succeeded. When they didn't, they failed. Then in chapter 24, in verse 29, Joshua died and was buried. The book of Joshua is followed by the book of Judges. The stories of Judges follow a consistent pattern. The people are unfaithful to Yahweh, God, and he therefore delivers them into the hands of their enemies. The people repent and beg God for mercy, which he sends in the form of a leader or a champion, a judge. The judge delivers the Israelites from oppression and they prosper, but soon they fall again in unfaithfulness and the cycle is repeated. We're going to read Judges 3, verse 1 through 11 here. Get a little flavor of what this is about. Now these are the nations that the Lord left to test all those in Israel who had no experience of any war in Canaan. It was only that successive generations of Israelites might know war, to teach those who had no experience of it before. The 5 lords of the Philistines, and all the Canaanites and the Sidonites and the Hivites who lived on Mount Lebanon, from Mount Baal Hermon as far as Lebo-hamath. They were for testing of Israel, to know whether Israel would obey the commandments of the Lord, which he commanded their ancestors by Moses. So the Israelites lived among the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, and they took their daughters as wives for themselves, and their own daughters they gave to their sons, and they worshipped their gods. The Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, forgetting the Lord their God and worshipping the Baals and the Asherahs. Therefore the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of King Cushan-Rishathaim of Aram Naharaim. And the Israelites served Cushan-Rishathaim 8 years. But when the Israelites cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer for the Israelites, who delivered them, Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel. He went out to war, and the Lord gave King Cushan-Rishathaim of Aram into his hand, and his hand prevailed over Cushan-Rishathaim. So the land had rest for 40 years. Then Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. So you see how it goes. And the stories in Judges are very similar to this. They're not faithful. They're in trouble. We send a champion to help them out. And here we end up with they had rest for 40 years. Then the very next verse, verse 12,
The Israelites did again what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord strengthened King Eglon of Moab against Israel, because they had done what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And this repeats itself over and over again. The book of Judges tells of a time in which the 12 tribes of Israel had people called judges who guided them. Sometimes the judges were similar to the judges we have today. They helped settle disputes. But sometimes they were more like military leaders, sometimes more like prophets. Here we're going to talk about a handful of the people in the book of Judges that were known as judges. Deborah, for example, was a prophet and a judge of Israel. She rendered her judgments beneath a date palm tree. The people of Israel had been oppressed by Jabin, king of Canaan, for 20 years. Stirred by the wretched condition of Israel, she sent a message to Barak at Kadesh of Naphtali. Naphtali is one of the 12 tribes. And tells him that the Lord God had commanded him to muster 10,000 troops of Naphtali and Zebulun, Zebulun being another of the 12 tribes, and concentrate them upon Mount Tabor. At the same time, she states that the Lord God of Israel will draw Sisera, commander of Jabin's army, to the river Kishon. Barak declines to go without the prophet, so Deborah consents but declares that the glory of the victory will therefore belong to a woman. As soon as the news of the rebellion reaches Sisera, he collects 900 chariots of iron and a host of people. In the battle, Sisera is completely defeated. He himself escapes on foot while his army is pursued and destroyed. Sisera comes to the tent of Jael, and he lies down to rest. He asks for a drink, she gives him milk, and while he's asleep, she hammers a tent pin through his temple. After the battle, there was peace in the land for 40 years. Some of the other well-known judges are Gideon and Samson. A story about Gideon is found in chapters 6 and 7. Gideon was a judge who led an army against the Midianites. He has 32,000 men in his army, but the Lord tells Gideon he must cut down the size of his army because otherwise the Israelites won't attribute their win to God, but rather to themselves. Gideon asks any person who is afraid to just leave, and 22,000 leave because of this. However, God said this is still too many people, too many soldiers. So he tells Gideon to go down to the river and see how the men drink. God then instructed Gideon to only keep people who drink like a dog, lapping it up with their tongues, sticking their face in the water. Gideon complied with this, which brought his army down to about 300. So that night, God instructs Gideon to go down to the Midianite valley to see what the Midianites were dreaming of. This was meant to relax and assure Gideon that God was on his side. In the valley, Gideon overhears a conversation between two Midianites in which one Midianite says he had a dream where a loaf of bread was tumbling down the hill to the Midianite's tent. The other Midianite interprets this as the sword of Gideon laying wrath upon the Midianites. After hearing this, Gideon decides to go back up the valley and begin his invasion. Gideon tells his people to split into 3 groups, then gives everyone trumpets and jars with torches in them. After marching to the Midianite camp, everyone blew their trumpets, broke their jars, then they stood there with the torches screaming, "A sword for the Lord and a sword for Gideon." And all the Midianites fled in terror. Gideonites sent messengers to the other Israelites about the Midianites. So the other Israelites captured the Midianites and killed their leaders. That's the story of Gideon. Samson is another judge. Samson was a Nazirite, and he was given immense strength to aid him against his enemies and allow him to perform superhuman feats, including slaying a lion with only the jawbone of an ass. However, if Samson's long hair were cut, then his Nazirite vow would be violated and he would lose his strength. Delilah, Samson's girlfriend, was working for the Philistines when she entices him. Samson falls asleep, and Delilah ordered a servant to cut his hair while he was sleeping and turned him over to the Philistine enemies, who gouged out his eyes and forced him to grind grain in a mill at Gaza. While there, his hair begins to regrow. When the Philistines took Samson into their temple, Samson asked to rest against one of the support pillars. After being granted permission, he prayed to God and miraculously recovered his strength, allowing him to bring down the columns, collapsing the temple, and killing himself, as well as all of the Philistines. There are several major themes that we see in Joshua and Judges. God's covenant requires commitment. You've got to follow what God tells you to do if it's going to work. Israel failed over and over, with the possible exception of Judah, which did pretty well. There's lots of violence and destruction. Their stories are not always in chronological order in Joshua and Judges. That would be particularly obvious if we read Joshua from beginning to end. We didn't do that. We just read little pieces of it. We read about some of the same kings and territories over and over again. We also find contradictions in the book of Joshua. In one place, we're told that Joshua has conquered nearly all the land of Canaan, and a few verses later, it sounds like most of Canaan is still in the hand of Israel's enemies. The books of Joshua and Judges were probably composites, written originally by several different authors over a period of time and then combined by a later redactor or editor. Finally, there's a perceived need for a king, which leads us to Samuel. Judges, in many ways, is parallel to the first book of Samuel. It raises the issue of kingship by discussing, for example, the possibility of Gideon becoming king. 4 times near the end of the book of Judges, we hear the phrase, "In those days there was no king in Israel." So we go on with Samuel. 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel begins with the story of Hannah. Hannah, the wife of Elkanah from the tribe of Ephraim, had no children. At the time of the sacrifice one year, Hannah prayed to the Lord for the children in the presence of the priest Eli. She vowed to give her first child to the Lord. Eli, who couldn't hear exactly what she was saying, thought she was just drunk. Eventually, the Lord remembered Hannah, and she had a son who she named Samuel. When the boy Samuel was old enough, she took him to Eli the priest in Shiloh, as she had promised to give him to the Lord. The second chapter of Samuel begins with a poem known as Hannah's Song. Many of the books of the Bible have poetry as little sections of them. Some are mostly poetry, like Psalms and Song of Solomon, but we find poems scattered out throughout the Old Testament. This is Hannah's Song from chapter 2, verse 1 through 11. Hannah prayed and said, "My heart exults in the Lord. My strength is exalted in my God. My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in my victory. There is no holy one like the Lord, no one beside you. There is no rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly. Let not arrogance come from your mouth, for the Lord is God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble gird on strength. Those who are full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who are hungry are fat with spoil. The barren has borne 7, but she who has many children is forlorn. The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low, he also exalts. He raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap, to make them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. He will guard the feet of his faithful ones, but the wicked shall be cut off in darkness. For not by might does one prevail. The Lord, his adversaries shall be shattered. Most High will thunder in heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the power of his anointed." Then Elkanah went home to Ramah, while the boy remained to minister the Lord in the presence of the priest Eli. So Eli had 2 sons who were much older than Samuel, who were pretty despicable. They themselves ate the meat
that was supposed to be sacrificed and otherwise disrespected the Lord's offering. So the boy Samuel was left with Eli the priest. His sleeping quarters were in the temple of the Lord where the Ark of the Covenant was kept in Shiloh. One night when Samuel was sleeping, Eli was in another room. And we hear the following story from chapter 3. And I'll read verse 4 through 21. Then the Lord called, Samuel, Samuel. And he said, Here I am. And ran to Eli and said, Here I am, for you called me. But he said, I did not call. Lie down again. So he went and lay down. The Lord called again, Samuel. Samuel got up and went to Eli, and he said, Here I am, for you called me. But he said, I did not call, my son. Lie down again. Now Samuel did not know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. The Lord called Samuel again a third time, and he got up and went to Eli and said, Here I am, for you called me. Then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, Go, lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. So Samuel went and lay down in his place. Now the Lord came and stood there, calling as before, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel said, Speak, for your servant is listening. Then the Lord said to Samuel, See, I am about to do something in Israel that will make both ears of anyone who hears it tingle. On that day I will fulfill against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house, from the beginning to end. For I have told him that I am about to punish his house forever, for the iniquity that he knew, because his sons were blaspheming God, and he did not restrain them. Therefore I swear to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be expiated by sacrifice or offering forever. Samuel lay there until morning. Then he opened the doors of the house of the Lord. Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli. But Eli called Samuel and said, Samuel, my son, he said, Here I am. Eli said, What was it that he told you? Do not hide it from me. May God do so to you, and more also, if you hide anything from me of all that he has told you. So Samuel told him everything and hid nothing from him. Then he said, It is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him. As Samuel grew up, the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, knew that Samuel was a trustworthy prophet of the Lord. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord. So sometime later, Israel went into battle with the Philistines, and Eli's two sons took the ark with them to the battle with the hope that the ark would help them win. Unfortunately, the Israelites were routed. Both of Eli's sons were killed, and the Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant. When Eli, who was 98 years old, heard the news, he fell backward off his chair, broke his neck, and died. The ark seemed to bring a curse to the Philistines, so they tried to figure out how to send it back. They asked their diviners and priests what to do, and they were told to attach 2 milch cows to the cart carrying the ark. So I'm reading from 1 Samuel 6, 10 through 16. Now the men did so, and they took 2 milch cows and yoked them to the cart and shut up their calves at home. They put the ark of the Lord on the cart, and the box with the gold mice and the images of their tumors. The cows went straight in the direction of Beth Shemesh along one highway, lowing as they went. And they turned neither to the right nor to the left. And the lords of the Philistines went after them as far as the border of Beth Shemesh. Now when the people of Beth Shemesh were reaping their wheat harvest in the valley, when they looked up and saw the ark, they went with rejoicing to meet it. The cart came into the field of Joshua of Beth Shemesh and stopped there. A large stone was there, so they split up the wood of the cart and offered the cows as a burnt offering to the Lord. The Levites took down the ark of the Lord and the box that was beside it, in which were the gold objects, and set them upon the large stone. Then the people of Beth Shemesh offered burnt offerings and presented sacrifices on that day to the Lord. When the 5 lords of the Philistines saw it, they returned that day to Ekron. So the ark got as far ultimately as Abinadab's house, and there it stayed. 20 years passes. Samuel was a priest. and a prophet. He assembled all of Israel at Mizpah. While they were there, the Philistines attacked. Under Samuel's leadership, the Israelites routed the Philistines. Samuel became a judge over all of Israel, and he built an altar to the Lord. And that's where we stop for today. In our next session, we will begin with 1 Samuel chapter 8. We'll hear the stories of Saul and King David. We'll hear of Solomon's temple and the division of the kingdom of Israel. We hear about the prophets Amos and Isaiah. Until then, be safe, and I hope to see you Sunday.